Before there were kings on mountains, before there were temples, altars, wars, or names spoken with reverence, there was a silence so wide that even silence had not yet learned how to sound. There was no blue above and no dark below. There was no sunrise waiting behind a horizon, because no horizon had yet been drawn. There was only the first vastness, unshaped, unmeasured, without edge, without promise, without memory. In that immeasurable stillness, the earliest powers began to gather, not all at once, but the way a dream gathers around a sleeping mind. The deep earth came first, broad and patient, a body for all future things. The abyss opened beneath, ancient even in its first breath. Desire stirred too, not as love in the mortal sense, but as the first movement toward becoming, the hidden urge that makes what is still become what will be. Out of that old beginning, sky leaned over earth, and the world discovered the first embrace and the first pressure. Mountains rose, valleys settled, shadows pooled, and the earliest family of power entered the newborn world. But even at the beginning, creation did not arrive pure and peaceful. It arrived carrying strain within it, as though order itself had been born with a hairline crack running through its heart. The sky, radiant and immense, looked upon his children and feared what they might one day become. The earth, fertile and enduring, looked upon the same children and could not bear to see them buried by fear. So the first generations of the cosmos learned what many generations after them would learn again and again, that love mixed with fear becomes control, and control, when pressed too hard, begins to make its own destroyer. The old powers grew in number and strangeness. Titans took shape, mighty and bright, each carrying some portion of the world's first force. Rivers had their minds, memory had a face, fire had lineage. Time itself had not yet become a ruler, but it was already waiting somewhere in the dark, listening. And from among those ancient children would come one young Titan with a patient gaze and a clever hand, a son who would lift a blade against his father and begin the long family pattern that would one day reach the child called Zeus. So even before the first thunder gathered, before any eagle cut through divine air, the story had already begun to lean toward prophecy. The cosmos was beautiful, vast, and half asleep, but beneath its stillness there was already the faintest sensation of inheritance, as though the world knew that one day the sky would tremble not from storm, but from the fear of being replaced. And because this is a story meant to be heard slowly, it helps to linger here before names and battles gather in earnest. Imagine the first earth not as a map, but as a sleeping body. Imagine the first sky not yet ruled, only stretched above everything in patient immensity. Imagine the earliest beings moving through that half-made world without footsteps, because even ground was still deciding how to hold weight. In such a place, the future did not race forward, it unfolded. One power touched another, one generation leaned over the next. Light and darkness were still learning where to rest. The calm was never absolute, yet it was real enough to be remembered. Zeus would one day inherit storms, but his deeper inheritance began here, in a cosmos where beauty and danger were born together, and neither could be separated from the other. That is why his story feels older than kingship. He belongs first to atmosphere, to depth, to those enormous beginnings where everything is still becoming, and every act will echo longer than the one who performs it can possibly know. To listen to Zeus well, then, is to begin not with thunder, but with the deep breathing of the world before thunder had a name. Cronus rose in a world still close to its making, when stone felt newer, waters ran with a colder brightness, and each divine decision left marks that would last for ages. He was not the eldest among his kin, nor the most openly radiant, but he possessed a quality older powers often mistake for loyalty, until it is too late. He knew how to wait. When his mother placed the jagged promise of rebellion into his hand, he did not rush toward destiny. He listened to it. He understood that power rarely falls because it is attacked from afar. It falls because it forgets that someone close by has grown tired of kneeling. And so, the old sky, who had pressed his children out of sight and out of daylight, learned in one violent instant what fear creates when it is fed for too long. Cronus struck. The first great overthrow was completed, and a son took the place of a father beneath the vault of heaven. Yet, even as he claimed the world, the shape of the story betrayed him. The one who seizes a throne by answering fear often becomes the next servant of fear. The moment the throne is warm beneath him, it was said to Cronus, in one form or another, that the pattern would return. A child of his own would rise as he had risen. A son or daughter of his house would one day stand where he stood and look at him with the same inevitable resolve with which he had once looked upward. From that moment, the Titan who had defeated his father ceased to live as a victor and began to live as a prisoner of tomorrow. Rhea brought forth children one by one, and one by one, they vanished into the terrible solution he called safety. Hestia was swallowed into darkness, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. Each loss happened with the brutal speed of nightmare. No cradle song lasted long enough to become memory. No tiny hand remained in the light long enough to be held twice. Rhea endured it until endurance itself began to feel like a form of death. The halls of the Titans grew full of grandeur and empty of tenderness. The world continued turning, but above that turning lay the suffocating stillness of a household arranged around dread. And because fear always mistakes delay for victory, Cronus believed himself wise. He believed that if he devoured the future would stop coming. Yet, prophecy is rarely undone by violence. More often it is shaped by violence, sharpened by it, given its moral force by the very hand that tries to prevent it. So when Rhea carried her last child, grief hardened inside her into a quieter thing than anger, and far more dangerous. Somewhere beyond the Titan's reach, the sea waited, the island waited, the cave waited, and the child who would inherit not only the sky, but the burden of breaking this pattern was almost ready to enter the world. Rhea carried this knowledge in her body. Every child born into fear teaches fear something new about how to continue. But every child saved from fear teaches the world that repetition is not absolute. She watched Cronus rule and saw how suspicion hollows even the mighty from within. No song eased him, no harvest reassured him, no victory lasted. He had consumed his heirs and still could not sleep peacefully, because what he truly feared was not any single infant, but the existence of succession itself. To be replaced was, in his mind, to be erased. That confusion made his kingdom cold. It also made his fall inevitable. Though inevitability can take a long time to reveal itself, the House of the Titans gleamed with old greatness, but beneath that gleam lay the hush of interrupted nurture, of rooms that should have known growth, and instead knew only waiting. Zeus would be born into that silence as its answer, though not yet as its master. For now he existed only as pressure approaching, like distant weather felt by those who do not yet see the cloud. Rhea did not flee in triumph. She fled the way exhausted hope flees, with a body worn down by sorrow, and a heart too bruised to imagine victory clearly, yet unwilling to surrender one final time. Night covered her path as she crossed the waters toward Crete. The moon kept itself veiled behind wandering cloud. The sea lifted and lowered beneath her, like a dark animal breathing in sleep. No chorus of gods announced her passage. No revelation lit the sky. Everything about that journey belonged to secrecy. The salt damp in the air, the ache in her limbs, the hush of oars and waves, the way fear becomes steadier when it is carried for the sake of another life. On the island, high among rough stone and hidden slopes, there was a cave where the mountain opened, inward and seen. For a moment, less like earth than like shelter remembered from before the world was hard. There, in that enclosed darkness with the smell of wet rock and wild herbs around her, Rhea gave birth to the child whose first inheritance was concealment. He did not arrive with a crown upon his head or a thunderbolt in his hand. He arrived as all children do, small, vulnerable, loud with life, his body trembling in air colder than the warmth he had just left. Yet even in that first cry, there was something unsettling, not because it sounded mighty, but because it sounded impossible to erase. Rhea held him against her breast and understood that this was the sound Cronus had tried to silence before it could ever begin. She wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth, shaping absence into the image of an infant, and carried that false child back toward the hungry certainty of the Titan King. He took the bundle and swallowed it without pausing to ask whether fear had once again made a fool of him. So the deception passed. The youngest child lived, the future remained in the light, and in the mountain cave, where torch glow breathed softly against stone and drops of water, slid slowly down the walls, the one destined to challenge heaven rested for the first time. Around him gathered older kinds of care than law or empire ever offer, the patient arms of nymphs, the vigilance of those who listen for danger, the humble labor of keeping a child warm, fed, and hidden. Here, before the world knew him, Zeus belonged not to the throne, but to refuge. This mattered more than he would fully understand for a long time, because throughout the long years ahead, through war and judgment and the fatigue of immortality, some part of him would always be searching for this first safe darkness again, for the place where rain whispered outside the cave mouth, where fire stayed low and kind, and where power had not yet been asked to become destiny. For a while afterward, the cave remained thick with the dazed tenderness that follows a narrow escape. The women and spirits who attended the newborn moved more softly than before, as though ordinary motions might still betray them. Every small need became sacred through danger. A blanket adjusted, a sleeping child checked, a low flame preserved through the night. There is a kind of heroism in such acts that myth often rushes past in its hunger for crowns and battles. But without these acts there would be no crown, no battle, no future at all. Zeus survived first because someone hid him, someone fed him, someone listened for footsteps, someone kept watch while others rested. The memory of such protection never entirely left him. Even when he later presided over immense councils, some part of his soul still recognized the holiness of simple guardianship. It is why his story can soothe as well as thrill. Beneath all the grandeur lies a child kept alive by care so patient that it almost disappears into the dark. The cave on Crete became more than a hiding place. It became the first shape of Zeus's inner world, the chamber in which Storm learned patience and command, first learned how to listen. The child was given to the care of mountain spirits and old attendants, whose wisdom did not resemble the wisdom of courts. They knew the sounds of weather before weather broke. They knew which roots healed fever, which shadows concealed movement, which hours of dawn were safest for gathering milk and water without leaving a trace. When he cried, armed dancers struck bronze against bronze so that the sound would scatter against the cliffs and be mistaken for ritual or wind. When he slept, torchlight made the cave walls move with slow amber breathing. The sacred goat that nourished him stood as humble proof that abundance does not always enter the world in splendid form. Everything around his childhood taught the same quiet lesson. What preserves life is often small, repetitive, and nearly invisible. He grew as divine children do, yet his growth never felt hurried inside that hidden mountain light. Seasons folded softly over the island. Mist curled around the slopes in the morning, and thinned toward noon. At dusk he watched eagles turn black against gold light. At night he lay on skins near the fire and followed the stars with the seriousness of a child, already aware that something immense waits for him. Just beyond language, he learned the pulse of thunder, first in the distance. Long before he understood it as part of himself, he felt storms approach in his bones. He sensed rivers not as things to cross, but as motions in a larger living body. The nymphs taught him the names of herbs, winds, and constellations. The mountain taught him endurance. The cave taught him stillness. And somewhere beneath these visible lessons ran another current altogether, a dim ache that entered his sleep and lingered after waking. At times he felt presences he could not see, siblings swallowed, but not extinguished, lives held inside an unnatural darkness created by fear. Their silence reached him not as speech, but as pressure, as unfinishedness, as the sense that part of his own family existed in suspension, waiting for a hand to open what had been sealed. So Zeus's childhood was never fully innocent, yet it was not broken either. It was threaded through with softness, secrecy, and the long tenderness of those who understood that even a being marked for greatness must first be allowed to feel moss underfoot, cold air on skin, the comfort of warm milk, the rhythm of rain. This was the secret wealth of his hidden years. Before he became a ruler of sky, he became a listener to quiet things, and that capacity, more than any weapon forged later, would help him endure the weight of being the one everyone expected to rise. Sometimes, in those hidden years, he would stand at the mouth of the cave before dawn and watch the world change color very slowly. First the black sea would turn slate, then silver, then the edges of leaves would catch light, then the ridges beyond would separate themselves from shadow. Nothing in those mornings demanded speed. Even greatness, if it is to endure, must learn how to enter quietly. Zeus watched the day arrive this way again and again, and perhaps that is why he never became only a creature of sudden bolts. Yes, there was swiftness in him. Yes, there was terrifying force, but there was also this long apprenticeship to gradual revelation, to the beauty of things unfolding in their right order. He learned that hiddenness is not always weakness. Sometimes it is ripening. Sometimes it is protection granted until strength can become more than reaction. When he later looked down on the waking worlds of gods and mortals, he often did so with something of those cave-mouth mornings still inside him. A memory of light arriving carefully, one surface at a time. As the boy lengthened into youth, the world beyond Crete stopped feeling remote. Rumor reached him, not in words carried by messengers, but in changes of pressure through creation itself. Certain winds arrived tense, certain silences felt held too tightly. Even the sea below the mountain sometimes looked as if it were waiting for something to be decided. By then, Zeus had learned enough to understand that hiddenness could not be a permanent country. The cave had protected him, but it could not become his whole life without turning refuge into another prison. It was during those years of deepening awareness that Metis came to him, not as some courtly lecturer with tidy doctrines, but as the living intelligence of strategy itself. She appeared in a place half veiled by forest haze, where the earth smelled of pine and rain-wet bark, and she spoke to him as one who had watched many rulers destroy themselves by confusing force with mastery. Power, she taught him, is clumsy when it is frightened. It lashes first, questions later, and in doing so builds the path by which its replacement arrived. If Zeus was to face the house of Cronus, he must not become merely a younger version of the same terror. Her teaching entered him slowly, the way groundwater enters stone. She did not urge him toward haste. She taught him to watch the shape of consequence, to see where fear makes minds predictable to understand that rescue and overthrow are not always accomplished by the loudest blow. He learned that patience need not mean passivity, and that cunning, when bent toward restoration rather than domination, can be a form of justice. These lessons mattered because Zeus already possessed the beginnings of overwhelming force. Storm was native to him. Anger, when it rose, felt vast, but Metis taught him to hold back just enough to let intelligence lead first. Under her guidance, he stopped imagining destiny as a sudden glorious moment and began to recognize it as a long discipline. By the time he descended the mountain more often and walked the lower paths where the island opened toward wider horizons, he no longer resembled a child waiting for rescue. He resembled a will becoming deliberate, yet for all his growing readiness, the memory of the cave remained close in him. When twilight softened the ridges, he still paused to look back toward the dark opening that had sheltered him. The hidden years did not fall away. They settled deeper. And that is why, when the time finally came to move toward his father's world, Zeus carried something rare into the approach of power. Not only ambition, and not only grievance, but a memory of quiet worth preserving. He would go forward not simply to take a throne, but to make it possible for breathing, growing, ordinary life to exist outside the belly of fear. Metis also taught him to read what was not spoken. A tyrant may command the voices in his hall, she said in many forms, but he cannot command the currents beneath them. Watch the glance that lingers too long. Watch the servant who moves with too much care. Watch the feast that is too quiet. Watch the boast that arrives half a heartbeat too quickly. Fear leaves marks. Arrogance leaves gaps. A ruler who can read those signs understands more than one who simply crushes what displeases him. Zeus carried these lessons like hidden tools. They softened his haste without softening his resolve. He began to understand that destiny was not a fire into which one leaps blindly. It was a long road requiring inward governance. By the time he was ready to leave the mountain for more than a day, he had become a being strangely balanced between storm and listening. This balance would be tested and lost and found again many times. But its first true roots lay here, in the schooling of a young god who discovered that the sharpest weapon may be the mind that refuses panic. The halls of Cronus did not welcome tenderness. They were magnificent in the way winter can be magnificent, hard-edged, glittering, and almost hostile to softness. Zeus entered that old domain concealed by craft, not yet announcing himself with storm. To reveal his nature too soon would have been to fight on terms chosen by fear. Instead, he approached as one bearing service, his presence veiled, his purpose folded inward. Around him stood the relics of Titan rule, columns like frozen cliffs, chambers vast enough for echoes to seem cautious, old power gathered into forms that had endured so long they had mistaken duration for legitimacy. At the center of that world sat Cronus, still immense, still terrible, yet diminished by one thing he could never master: the constant effort of watching for tomorrow. Even before the cup reached his hand, prophecy had already been eating at him for years. Zeus could feel it in the air around the throne, the stale pressure of a reign built on interrupted births and unfinished family life. When the potion worked, it worked not like a neat trick, but like truth forcing its way back through flesh and denial. The old Titan convulsed, with the violence of a world refusing to remain sealed. One by one, the swallowed gods emerged again into light, not as infants restored to infancy, but as divine beings returning from an outrage against order. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, each drawn back from impossible confinement, each tasting air the way one tastes life after dreaming of suffocation. The moment had triumph in it, yes, but also shock, grief, and dislocation. For time had passed while they were trapped. Ages of the world had gone on without them. Zeus, who had known them first as absences, now knew them as faces, breaths, voices. It was the beginning of family, but family under extraordinary strain. Family formed not through shared childhood, but through shared deprivation and sudden release. In that hall of old power, the hidden child ceased to be hidden. There was no returning to anonymity after this. The world had shifted from secrecy into declaration. Yet, even here, after the violent release, Zeus did not rush directly into rage. He led his siblings away from the chamber of fear and gave them time to stand in open air, beneath a sky not yet theirs, but no longer wholly lost. The sea wind touched them. Light moved across their faces. Around them, creation seemed to exhale. This pause mattered. In another story, liberation would have served only as the prelude to louder war. In this one, liberation also became a return to sensation, to space, to the simple dignity of existing outside captivity. Only after that breath could battle truly begin, and the siblings, once freed, did not at once feel like a seamless household restored. They had each endured darkness in their own inward way. Their reunion carried relief, but also bewilderment. Hestia's calm had been forced to survive without any hearth to tend. Demeter's nurture had remained unrealized, stored up like rain in cloud. Hera's dignity had ripened beside fury. Hades had learned stillness so deep it already resembled the realm he would later govern. Poseidon carried in him the pressure of confined force, like sea held beneath rock. Zeus did not merely win allies in that hall. He received a family already shaped by deprivation. Their bond would have to be built in motion, in danger, in the practical labor of standing beside one another after impossible separation. That complexity gives the story depth. It means the new order was not founded by perfect beings stepping into natural roles. It was founded by survivors learning trust under strain. The air that first touched their faces outside Kronos' hall was not only freedom. It was beginning. Freedom alone was not enough. The old order still had strength, still had armies, still had the inertia of having ruled for an age so long that many parts of the cosmos had forgotten alternatives. Zeus and his newly freed siblings needed more than outrage and kinship. They needed alliances older than fear, deeper than Titan pride. So they went downward, toward the hidden places beneath ordinary light, into caverns where forgotten beings waited in stone and heat. Their Gaia's memory still pulsed through the earth. There the Cyclopes remained bound, ancient smiths of awe, terrible skill, imprisoned because rulers often fear the makers of things they do not fully understand. Zeus shattered their chains, not as a performance of dominance, but as a recognition that a just order cannot begin by keeping old talents buried for the convenience of the strong. The one-eyed smiths rose amid dust and fire. Their furnaces awakened, and the mountain began to sound like destiny being hammered into form. For days that could have been days or forges of pure myth, metal answered flame in the deep places of the world. The Cyclopes shaped gifts that were also responsibilities. For Poseidon, the trident fitted not merely to command the sea, but to feel its moods and fractures. For Hades, a helm through which unseenness might become strategy rather than erasure. For Zeus, not a common weapon, but the bolt in its first true divine form, concentrated storm made graspable, the raw sentence of sky given structure. Yet, the making of the thunderbolt was described less by noise than by rhythm. Hammer, breath, ember, glow. Hammer, breath, ember, glow. The work itself carried something soothing in its repetition, as if the world were reminding its future rulers that even the most fearsome tools begin in patience and craft. When Zeus at last held the bolt, the air did not explode into spectacle immediately. Instead, there was a charged stillness, a pause in which force recognized its bearer. He felt, in one trembling instant, the scale of what could be done through him, and the danger of mistaking capability for righteousness. The weapon answered his nature, but Métis's earlier warnings still lived in him. A ruler who delights too quickly in what he can do becomes indistinguishable from the tyrant he replaces. So when Zeus lifted the new forged power toward the clouded height, he did so not with exultation alone, but with a grave understanding that war, once fully awakened, would scar more than enemies. Still, the hour had come. The deep earth had given back its imprisoned strength. The siblings now stood, equipped not only with anger, but with means. Above them, the old sky waited, though not for long. The age of Titans was about to learn that hidden things do not remain hidden forever, and that the child once rocked in a cave now carried in his hand a fragment of the storm itself. At times during the forging, Zeus walked apart from the furnaces and stood where underground heat met cooler breath moving through cracks in the stone. There he tested the feel of the bolt not by using it, but by waiting with it. He let its charge settle into his palm and travel up his arm like a second pulse. It did not feel like possession. It felt like mutual recognition between a force and the one now required to guide it. The temptation to imagine himself already invincible must have been present, yet those quieter moments in the forge kept another truth alive. Weapons do not create wisdom. They merely widen the consequence of whatever wisdom or folly already exists in the hand that wields them. So the making of the thunderbolt became for Zeus a kind of vow, though no one else may have heard it. If he was to carry the concentrated voice of storm, then he must remember the cave, remember Metis. Remember that power without measure becomes only a louder version of fear. In this sense, the forge did more than arm him. It judged him in advance. The war that followed was remembered as vast, but vastness in such tales can become too bright, too loud, too waking if told carelessly. Better to imagine it as a long pressure laid upon the world. For 10 years the cosmos seemed to live beneath a tightening weather of conflict. Mountains were split, not in theatrical flashes every hour, but as if the earth itself had become the place where old grievances slowly ground against one another. Titans moved like ranges of living stone. The younger gods answered with swifter force, with lightning, tide, darkness, flame, and the newly formed cooperation of those who had suffered under the same fear. Zeus learned in battle what no hidden childhood and no lesson in strategy could teach him fully beforehand, that even necessary war stains the heart of the one who wages it. Again and again, he hurled storm against immensity. Again and again, the old order rose in wounded fury. Cronus fought like time made muscular, relentless and difficult to exhaust. The world shook, not because victory belonged easily to anyone, but because history itself was being forced to choose a different shape. Yet the war was not only destruction. Between clashes, there were pauses in which the sea breathed against rock, in which Demeter looked over scorched ground and imagined grain one day returning, in which Hestia kept some small sacramental flame alive for her siblings, so that they would remember what this struggle was for. These moments of return mattered. Without them, the war would have consumed its own purpose. Zeus, often seen from afar as the face of pure force, was sustained as much by these quieter intervals as by the thunderbolt. At last the balance tipped. The old weapons of Cronus failed against the steadier gathering of new order. The Titan King fell, not merely because he had been overpowered, but because the logic of his reign had run out. A world cannot remain forever arranged around swallowed children and suspended futures. He and many of his allies were cast down into the deep prison below, guarded not simply as punishment, but as containment for a violence that could not yet be trusted to vanish. And when the struggle ended, the first true dawn after war rose over a changed creation. Light touched broken slopes, torn plains, restless water, and the faces of victors who did not celebrate as though untouched. Zeus stood in that pale new morning, with the bolt lowered. The sky was quieter than he had ever known it. In the silence after such a storm, triumph felt less like shouting and more like breathing after a weight has finally been lifted from the chest. But with that breath came another recognition. The throne won. By ending fear would now test him differently. It is one thing to overthrow a father. It is another to rule without becoming the echo of him. The world, still trembling, now waited to see what sort of stillness would follow this victory. When the battles grew fiercest, Zeus sometimes felt the old hidden child stir inside the war-making god. Not as weakness, but as remembrance in the flash between one strike and the next. He could recall torchlight on damp stone, the smell of goat's milk, the rhythm of shield on shield, not as war, but as protection. Those memories steadied him. They prevented the conflict from becoming merely intoxicating. Return to safe, in the language of sleep, happened for Zeus as an inner motion, a brief recollection of what the world feels like when no one is trying to dominate it. That is what allowed him to keep fighting without being devoured by fighting. Even after Cronus fell, the most healing part of victory was not the sight of enemies cast down. It was the strange normality slowly returning to creation wind that no longer carried panic, earth that no longer shook under constant assault, sky able to hold light without immediately becoming a battlefield. In that eased weather, the purpose of the struggle finally became audible. The silence after the Titan War was unlike the silence before creation. The first silence had belonged to emptiness. This one belonged to aftermath. Smoke thinned above shattered ridges. Waters settled back into channels they half remembered. The new god stood in a world that looked both opened and exhausted, as though creation had survived some great fever and was now lying weak but conscious beneath the morning. In that quieter hour, Zeus did not seize everything into his own hands. That restraint became one of the first real proofs that a different order had been born. The great domains were divided, not casually, but in acknowledgement that balance requires distribution. The sea, vast and temperamental, answered to Poseidon. The underworld, solemn and necessary, became the charge of Hades. The sky, with its light, weather, judgment, and vantage, fell to Zeus. Around these larger sovereignties, the rest of the family also found form. Hestia's steadiness gathered around the hearth. Demeter's care reached toward field and harvest. Hera's dignity moved toward marriage, oath, and rank. A world scattered by conflict began to acquire structure. Olympus rose not only as a palace, but as an idea. Height joined to order, power placed where it might look out over all and yet still be accountable to the whole. Marble was imagined there, yes, and halls bright with cloud-washed air. But the deeper truth of Olympus lay in rhythm. Councils replaced panic. Assignments replaced swallowing. Fire was tended. Seats were given. Views were shared. Zeus shaped his throne, not simply to elevate himself, but to become a vantage from which he must keep watching, weighing, answering. For a time, that was enough. Peace entered the world softly, like clear weather after a season of storms. The younger gods moved through their new halls, with the strange caution of those unaccustomed to having room. Night over the mountain became almost gentle. Stars rested above the summit. The sacred flame burned without interruption. There were still scars everywhere, but scars in sunlight feel different from wounds in darkness. And yet, after some measure of restoration, a subtle incompleteness began to make itself known. The world had rulers, it had rivers, beasts, forests, tides, winds, and the recovered dignity of open life. But it lacked one thing that would trouble and fascinate Zeus more than any Titan had. being small enough to fail, curious enough to disobey, and fragile enough to awaken tenderness. The age of divine reordering had prepared the stage. Soon, the question of humankind would rise into it, and with that question, Zeus would discover that governing a healed cosmos may be simpler than governing creatures capable of hope, error, gratitude, and pride all at once. The early days on Olympus were full of experiments in peace. Not all of them succeeded at once. Gods who had spent ages under pressure do not instantly relax just because a mountain has been crowned with clean air and order. Tempers still flashed, old hurts still surfaced without warning. Some found new roles easier to inhabit than others. Yet there was something deeply restorative in the repetition of counsel, meal, judgment, and rest. Hestia's flame gave rhythm to gathering. Demeter looked for ways to return abundance to wounded land. Hera brought ceremony and seriousness, ensuring that power would not dissolve into mere loose companionship. Zeus listened more than he had during war. The sky over Olympus became, for a while, the very image of earned calm. White cloud moved at a measured pace. Eagles circled without alarm. Evening came down over the halls like cool water over heated stone. In those hours, it was possible to believe that the cycle had indeed been broken, and that a throne could become less an object of fear than a place from which balance is maintained. Peace on Olympus also depended on repetition, gentle enough to retrain a wounded cosmos. Mornings of council, afternoons of shaping roads, coastlines, and right. Evenings, when no one needed to brace for attack. The gods had to learn ordinary steadiness after extraordinary threat, and that learning took time. Zeus often discovered that ruling required attention to what seemed small, the settling of disputes before they became vendettas, the honoring of each sibling's realm without envy, the maintenance of shared ritual so that family did not dissolve into mere neighboring power. In these quieter disciplines the throne became real, not in a flash of conquest, but in the daily refusal to let chaos return through neglect. There are stories in which the making of humankind feels like a side note after the greater drama of gods and monsters. But in Zeus's long reign, the arrival of mortals changed the texture of the world more deeply than many wars. Prometheus, whose mind ran bright with foresight and sympathy, looked upon the ordered earth and saw that it still lacked a witness capable of wonder. Beasts moved according to instinct. Rivers followed their old carved logic. Trees rose and shed their leaves without needing to ask why they existed. But there was not yet any creature to lift its face toward the sky and feel both awe and longing. So from clay, breath, and design came humankind, not grand enough to rival the gods, but alive with a flickering interiority the gods themselves could not entirely predict. Zeus looked upon these new beings with divided feeling. He recognized beauty in their openness, in the way they reached toward warmth, shelter one another. Yet he also saw, almost at once, the danger of consciousness. Curiosity is small at first. It looks like a child leaning too close to a flame. Yet inside curiosity lies every future city, question, rebellion, prayer, and wound. Prometheus loved them more quickly and more openly than Zeus did. Where the king of gods saw a delicate balance to be managed, Prometheus saw creatures in need of lifting, and so came the theft that would become one of the central emotional pivots of Zeus's story. Fire, guarded in divine realms not merely as heat, but as transformative power, was taken and delivered into mortal hands. With it, night changed, food changed, shelter changed, tool, kiln, forge, and future changed. The glow of first hearths spread across the earth like a second constellation drawn lower, nearer, warmer than the stars. Mortals gathered around flame and discovered not only comfort, but possibility. Zeus, seeing that stolen brightness shine below, felt anger sharpen through him. But anger alone does not explain his response. What he saw was more unsettling than disobedience. He saw that the distance between heaven and earth had narrowed. He saw a species learning not merely to survive, but to alter its own conditions. That is the kind of change rulers fear most, because once granted, it cannot be ungranted. Even when Zeus struck back against Prometheus, even when punishment entered the story, some quieter truth had already been established. The human world had been awakened irreversibly, and like all awakenings, it brought both illumination and unrest. Still, after the first fury passed, there remained a sight. Zeus could not entirely resist the image of frail beings holding a little ring of fire against darkness. Their faces lit from below, their voices softened into story. It was dangerous, yes. It was also, in its way, beautiful. The trouble with mankind would always be this mixture. Their boldness alarmed him, but their striving stirred in him a reluctant admiration he could never fully extinguish. At times, Zeus descended unseen to watch these new beings more closely. He saw them flinch from cold and huddle together for warmth. He saw them discover the usefulness of stone, the shape of shelter, the first rough tenderness of shared labor. He saw hands blister, then grow stronger. He saw simple grief over hunger, and sudden delight at fruit found or fish caught. There was no grandeur in these scenes, yet he could not entirely turn away. Mortality condensed significance. Every small gain mattered because it was not guaranteed. Even before Prometheus intervened, the human world already possessed a quiet power of attraction for Zeus, precisely because it was so perishable. When fire then entered their keeping, the change looked almost miraculous in its intimacy. Shadows withdrew from walls, conversation lengthened into the night. Sparks rose upward like tiny messengers to the stars. Zeus feared what this meant, but he also understood why Prometheus had loved them enough to risk punishment. A creature that can gather around flame and tell a story has already become difficult to rule by distance, alone. Prometheus understood something Zeus resisted admitting aloud, that fragile beings often honor the world more intensely because they know they can lose it. Mortals looked at dawn as if dawn were not guaranteed. They tasted bread as if hunger were never far away. They feared winter because winter might actually end them. This vulnerability sharpened perception. Zeus sometimes mistook it for weakness, yet part of him already knew it was another kind of strength. To live under limit and still make beauty is no small thing. That is why humanity drew his attention so persistently. In their brief spans they rehearsed, in condensed form, the same tensions. The gods lived on a grander scale: desire, rivalry, tenderness, invention, pride. They were small mirrors, and Zeus could not help looking into them. If fire taught mortals possibility, Pandora taught them cost. Zeus would not let the human story proceed as though every ascent came without consequence. Yet the tale is better understood not as a simple act of vengeance, but as a mythic recognition that consciousness opens both delight and suffering at once. Pandora was shaped with care and contradiction. Beauty clung to her naturally. Grace moved through her. Speech came smooth. Curiosity, however, sat near the center of her being like a small lamp that could never quite stop burning. The sealed vessel placed in her keeping was not merely a trick. It was a boundary, and boundaries in myth are rarely stable for long when desire, ignorance, and wonder gather around them. She lived for a time under warning, under the instruction not to look, not to open, not to know. But prohibition has a strange effect on minds not built to remain inert. It creates its own magnetism. When the vessel opened, the world changed with a speed no prayer could fully stop. Sickness moved outward, Weariness entered flesh. Envy found resting places in human hearts. Grief ceased to be an exception and became a condition of life. Labor grew heavy. Death stopped being distant and became intimate. Yet myth, when it is most humane, rarely leaves the world stripped bare. At the bottom remained hope, not large enough to cancel suffering, not powerful enough to erase mortality, but persistent enough to make endurance possible. That small surviving thing matters enormously in a sleep story because it changes the texture of everything after it. Humanity is not abandoned to sheer despair. Instead, it becomes the species that wakes each day knowing difficulty, and still lights the fire, still needs bread, still sings to children, still buries the dead and plants in spring. Zeus watched this development with a gaze more complex than many later tellings allow. The pain, unleashed under his order, did not produce simple ruin. It produced depth. Mortals became beings who could lose and yet continue. They became more like the world itself, beautiful not because untouched, but because scarred and still alive. This realization did not make Zeus gentle all at once. It did, however, widen his understanding. A king who governs only innocence governs almost nothing, because innocence never stays. To rule a real world is to rule beings who ache, fail, recover, desire, and fear. So after Pandora, the human realm darkened, but it also grew strangely richer. Even the gods, looking down from bright Olympus, had to admit that there was a solemn beauty in seeing little mortal lights continue to burn against a now more difficult night. And afterward, once sorrow had entered human life more fully, Zeus began to notice a strange deepening in mortal expression. Faces altered, songs altered, prayer altered. Before, praise had been simpler, almost childlike. Now, supplication carried urgency. Gratitude carried a sharper edge because it existed beside loss. The first funerary customs grew. The first consoling gestures mattered. Mothers learned to soothe not only hunger but fear. Friends learned to remain beside one another in illness. Hope, small though it was, became active exactly because suffering had become real. This is one of the quiet paradoxes at the center of Zeus's reign. The world became more difficult, but also more meaningful. Mortals gained the possibility of courage because they now had something genuine to endure. Even from Olympus, the difference could be felt. Their songs rose thinner, sadder, and somehow more beautiful. Zeus, listening, may have recognized in them an echo of his own life. The truth that greatness without vulnerability is impressive, but rarely moving. Hope remaining behind mattered to Zeus more than he first admitted. Without it, suffering would have made mortals useless as subjects and unbearable as a spectacle. With it, they became participants in their own continuance. They repaired what storms destroyed. They buried their dead and still planted. They learned lullabies precisely because night had become frightening. They learned prayer because certainty had gone. In this way, the world after Pandora became more suited to deep story. Every warm room meant more against winter. Every act of care meant more against pain. And every peaceful sleep became, however briefly, a victory. Zeus, watching from above, began to see that endurance itself might be a form of worship. It was not enough for Zeus to be the wielder of thunder. If his reign were to outlast the old age of fear, he had to become something harder and subtler, a keeper of measure. Law in the world of gods did not arrive as stacked scrolls or tidy arguments. It arrived as repeated boundaries taught through story, consequence, and ritual memory. Zeus began to shape the moral weather of the cosmos. Hospitality became sacred, because a world in which the stranger may be mistreated without consequence quickly returns to chaos. Oaths became heavy because spoken bonds are the fragile bridges by which families, kingdoms, and councils cross uncertainty. Hubris became dangerous because Zeus had seen what pride untethered from limit had done to Uranus, to Cronus, and to every ruler who mistook possession for permanence. The tales later told of men who insulted guests, who defied divine order, who imagined themselves equal to the structure that held them. Some were spun forever in punishment. Some starved beside abundance. Some labored under pointless repetition. These punishments were not merely displays of power. They were myths turned into warnings, meant to say that reality itself has grain, and one cannot live forever against it. Yet, Zeus was never memorable for wrath alone. What made his rule enduring in the minds of mortals was that he also rewarded shelter, humility, and the keeping of faith. A poor household that welcomed the weary stranger could receive blessing more profound than any palace that turned him away. Fields opened to rain when gratitude remained alive. Altars mattered less to him than the condition of the heart kneeling beside them. This double movement, strike and shield, thunder and rain, became his signature. He could terrify because he was capable of ruin. He could be revered because he also knew restraint. There were nights on Olympus when the great halls felt quiet, and Zeus sat with the bolt across his knees, looking not at enemies, but at the small mortal world flickering below. He saw kings bargaining, farmers worrying over weather, mothers keeping watch beside sickbeds, travelers hoping the next door would open. The scale of human life both saddened and steadied him. Mortals did not have the luxury of eternal postponement. Their choices mattered because time pressed them, perhaps for that very reason. Their acts of kindness carried a density divine beings sometimes lack. Zeus learned, slowly, that justice administered without compassion curdles into cold pride, but compassion, without structure, collapses into sentiment and leaves the vulnerable unguarded. So he became, in the best of his long reign, the storm held just within limit, the authority that reminds a world of boundaries, while also sending the rain that lets it live. And still, even a god of law is not safe from hunger of another sort. The next unrest in Zeus's life would not come from rebels or oath-breakers. It would come from the restlessness of his own heart. The stories of punishment traveled far precisely because they condensed principles into images the mind could hold at night. A wheel turning without end, water too near to drink, fruit too high to reach, a stone pushed upward only to fall. Such images entered the mortal imagination and stayed there, working more deeply than abstract command. Zeus understood, perhaps better than later moralists gave him credit for, that the heart remembers pictures long after it forgets lectures. Yet, just as important were the gentler tales, the poor couple whose welcome transformed their hut into blessing, the traveler sheltered in storm, the field watered after patient prayer. These stories made Zeus legible, not only as fearsome, but as responsive. A lawgiver must be imaginable in more than one emotional register, or else he hardens into a caricature of force. The old god of thunder avoided that reduction by remaining, at key moments, the center of nourishing rain. Mortals could tremble at him and still hope in him. That double relation bound them more deeply to his sky than terror alone ever could. There were moments, too, when Zeus withheld punishment and did not announce that he was doing so. A boast went unanswered, a slight passed into weather and disappeared. An offense that might once have drawn a bolt instead met only silence. Such restraint never becomes famous in myth, because nothing spectacular marks it. Yet those invisible decisions shaped the rain as surely as any punishment did. They reveal a Zeus learning, however imperfectly, that authority ripens when it does not need to answer every irritation. In that sense, his maturity resembled weather settling after storm season. The sky still possessed thunder. It simply no longer had to prove it every day. Power leaves many appetites unsatisfied. Zeus discovered this not because he lacked splendor around him, but because splendor cannot answer loneliness. Olympus shone, councils gathered, law took root, mortals prayed. Yet inside the king of gods there remained an unsettled movement, a reaching beyond accomplishment toward intimacy, admiration, novelty, and sometimes mere release from the stillness that follows too much responsibility. His loves became numerous not only because he desired greatly, but because no single bond quieted the whole weather of his nature. With Metis there had been counsel and depth, a mind sharp enough to walk beside sovereignty. With Themis there was order and balance, the sense of a throne supported by principle. With Hera there was majesty, rank, challenge, and the painful truth that equality does not guarantee harmony. With others, there came fascination, tenderness, secrecy, delight, or disaster. The world of myth remembers the transformations, bull, swan, shower of gold, because divine approach often had to pass through forms mortals could survive. But beneath those changing images lay the same pattern. Zeus leaning again and again toward connection, and again discovering that desire can create lineage without curing solitude. Hera, most of all, made that loneliness visible. She was no minor consort drifting in the light of a greater power. She was regal, exacting, wounded, brilliant, fiercely aware of what it means to stand beside a husband whose attention does not remain still. Their marriage held the paradox of Olympus itself. Authority joined to conflict, legitimacy joined to resentment, splendor joined to repeated fracture. When harmony briefly existed between them, the world seemed almost easier to inhabit. When jealousy and betrayal reopened their familiar wound, even heaven felt more brittle. Zeus did not emerge from these entanglements noble in every instance. Myth does not flatter him consistently, nor should it. But what makes the long arc of his loves matter in a sleep narrative is not scandal. It is the sense that even the ruler of sky is divided within himself. He can judge others while remaining unresolved. He can send law into the world and still fail to make peace within his own household. He can father beauty, talent, and heroism while also scattering grief behind him. In quiet hours after feasts, when music drifted thinly through Olympus and cloudlight dimmed around the columns, Zeus sometimes sat alone and listened to distant thunder as though it belonged to someone else. That sound, half memory and half confession, carried the ache of a being who could govern realms but not secure contentment. And from these loves, messy and glorious and burdensome, came children who would spread his force across the world, in forms subtler and more various than any single thunderbolt. There were nights when Zeus looked down upon the sleeping world and saw torchlight in scattered valleys, then turned and found Hera's seat empty beside him. In such moments, the grandeur of Olympus felt almost theatrical, as if all its marble and brilliance were staging, meant to conceal a simpler truth. No height cures the ache of incompletion. He had chosen, desired, pursued, transformed, fathered, yet desire repeated itself because each fulfillment remained partial. Perhaps that is one reason his loves became so mythically numerous. They express not the abundance of satisfaction, but the persistence of unrest. Still, from each union, the world gained some new texture, beauty, lineage, art, rule, healing, danger, story. Even Zeus's excesses became woven into the living density of myth. The cost was real, especially to those caught in Hera's fury or mortal vulnerability. But the result was also a world more crowded with significance than before. Olympus did not become cleaner through his loves. It became more humanly legible. Some children inherit a throne. Zeus's children inherited aspects of weather. From him came not one repeating image, but an entire constellation of powers that made his reign feel wider than his own person. Athena emerged in the most startling way of all, born from a crisis of thought and prophecy, stepping into the world armed and lucid, as though intelligence itself had decided it would no longer remain hidden inside another being. In her, Zeus encountered a reflection he could respect without pity. Judgment joined to strategy, force disciplined by clarity. Apollo and Artemis arrived through exile and endurance, bringing with them the balanced brilliance of music and moonlight, prophecy in wilderness, healing in the clean distance of the hunt. Hermes came with quickness, mischief, and the delightful insolence of a mind that can cross boundaries before others notice they exist. Dionysus, twice born through danger, carried a different inheritance altogether. Ecstasy, release, grief transformed into celebration, the unsettling truth that order alone cannot sustain life without some holy permission to loosen. These children mattered because they dispersed Zeus's burden. Through them the world learned that sky can become many things: reason, lyric, pursuit, laughter, intoxication, radiance. The king of gods no longer stood alone as the sole expression of divine will. He existed now in relation to daughter, to son, to strange younger power that both belonged to him and exceeded him in specific ways. There was relief in that, and pride. Watching Athena speak in council, Zeus could feel his own better judgment living outside himself. Hearing Apollo's music drift over the mountain, he could sense that authority might also heal. Seeing Artemis move untouched through wild places, he remembered that not all sacred life belongs in halls. In Hermes, he recognized the necessity of flexibility. In Dionysus, the danger and gift of surrender. So the household of Olympus grew richer and harder to control. Feasts became brighter, rivalries multiplied, affections knotted with politics. Yet amid all this complexity, there remained a subtle softening in Zeus whenever he looked upon those children who carried fragments of him without merely duplicating him. Legacy, he began to understand, is not the production of copies. It is the release of powers into the world that continue the original force in forms the origin could never have imagined alone. Even so, among all the children linked to his lightning, one mortal-born son would place the deepest pressure on Zeus's heart. For where the others displayed dimensions of divinity, this one would reveal what divinity looks like when dragged through pain, guilt, labor, and the limits of human flesh. In him, Zeus would see not the serenity of order, but the terrible beauty of endurance. And because these children differed so strongly from one another, they also prevented Zeus from mistaking himself for the whole of divine possibility. Athena's severity corrected him. Apollo's lyric brightness softened the atmosphere around power. Artemis embodied a freedom no throne could contain. Hermes reminded him that borders are useful, but never absolute. Dionysus exposed the limits of dignity when it hardens into repression. Each child, in a different key, challenged the king of gods to recognize that rule is not sameness spread outward. It is the difficult art of holding many energies within one order without crushing their distinctness. The more Olympus filled with these varied presences, the less Zeus could imagine his authority a solitary command. He became instead the central weather around which other climates moved. This did not always make him wiser, but it did make his reign more spacious. And spaciousness, in sleep storytelling, is a form of mercy. It gives the listener room to breathe between heavier mythic events. Heracles entered the world already entangled in anger, not his own. From the first breath, his life bore the mark of Hera's hurt and Zeus's divided loyalties. Yet his story matters not merely because he was strong. Many mythic beings are strong. Heracles matters because his strength had to pass through degradation, madness, labor, and remorse before it became admirable. As a child, he revealed astonishing force, but the deeper truth of his life was not precocious might. It was that power, without inward governance, can become catastrophe, even in one born from divine lineage. When madness struck, and he destroyed what he loved most, the legend turned from marvel into burden. Nothing in Zeus's own ascent had prepared him more painfully than watching a son of his blood brought low, not by enemies alone, but by distorted vision within. The king of gods could strike mountains and command storms, but he could not spare Heracles the necessity of atonement. That refusal to erase consequence became, strangely, one of the sternest forms of fatherly regard he ever showed. The labors that followed should not be heard only as action episodes. Heard properly, they are a sleepful sequence of ordeals by which violence is slowly refined into service. Beast after beast, task after task, distance after distance. Heracles moved through a world that kept asking more of him than brute force. He strangled, hunted, captured, cleansed, journeyed, bargained, descended, and returned. But beneath the variety of deed lay one continuity. He was carrying his own shattered self through work severe enough to shape it anew. Zeus watched from above with pride pierced by helplessness. At times he laughed at the absurdity of kings hiding in jars at the sight of seat, a captured boar. At times he grieved the exhaustion etched into his son's mortal body. At times he saw in Heracles something almost more moving than raw heroism, the stubborn willingness to continue after having become the source of one's own ruin. That is a deeply human grandeur, and Zeus, for all his sky-born power, could only admire it from a distance. When the end came, and Heracles passed through flame toward a transformed existence, the ascent felt less like reward than like completion. Pain had not destroyed him. It had tempered him. Zeus received him not simply as a mighty son, but as proof that redemption can be more astonishing than innocence. In the quiet after that elevation, something shifted in the Thunderer's heart. He had fathered a hero, yes, but more importantly, he had witnessed mortal suffering become a path to dignity rather than annihilation. That sight softened him. It taught him that frailty, endured nobly, may carry a form of greatness even gods cannot counterfeit, and it prepared him, in a melancholy way, for the next vast human drama in which glory and grief would once again braid themselves together beneath his watch. The long-burning fate of Troy. In later quiet, mortals would remember the labors as feats and list them proudly. But what lingered for Zeus was the cadence of his son's persistence. Again he rose. Again he walked toward what would have frightened another man into refusal. Again he carried the weight of command, not because he loved subservience, but because he needed structure through which to spend his grief. This repetition gave the story its sleep-like quality. Task, journey, confrontation, return. Task, journey, confrontation, return. It is the rhythm by which a damaged soul slowly relearns itself. Zeus, who could alter weather with emotion, could not gift Heracles a shorter road without stealing the road's meaning. So he watched, and in watching learned a kind of humility rare among immortals. There are transformations even a god cannot perform on behalf of another. Some beings must pass through their own fire. When Heracles at last did, Zeus understood that mortality's greatest dignity may lie not in avoiding suffering, but in carrying it until it changes shape. At times Zeus wondered whether Heracles moved closer to the truth of kingship than kings themselves. Not because the hero ruled cities, but because he understood burden without glamour. To carry a task no one envies, to keep going while haunted, to accept command for the sake of cleansing rather than pride. These are royal disciplines stripped of ornament. When Zeus saw that, his admiration deepened into something quieter than triumph. He recognized in his son a mortal capacity rarely available to immortals, the ability to become wise through exhaustion. The gods could change forms, realms, and laws, but they did not tire in the same redemptive way. Heracles did, and because he did, his victories settled deeper into the fabric of human memory. Troy began, as great ruins often do, with something that appeared almost too slight to justify its eventual cost. A slight at a wedding, a contest of beauty, a mortal prince asked to judge among divine powers. Such beginnings matter because they reveal one of myth's favorite truths. Catastrophe rarely announces itself honestly at the door. It arrives wearing vanity, desire, wounded pride, or a flattering promise. Paris chose according to longing, and the world paid according to consequence. Helen was taken, or followed, or was drawn by forces too interwoven for simple telling. Oaths stirred, ships gathered, kings discovered that old promises, once spoken, may drag whole generations into fire. Zeus watched this convergence with an awareness unlike the one he had possessed during the Titan War. Then, he had been central force. Here, he became something closer to weary witness. The gods themselves split into camps, carried by preference. Insult, affection, and old entanglement. Hera's grievance burned, Athena's scorn sharpened, Aphrodite protected what desire had begun. Ares, Apollo, Poseidon, all found their own reasons to lean toward one side or another. The world below became a field where divine bias and mortal ambition fed each other for 10 bitter years. What made the Trojan War so heavy in Zeus's long memory was not simply the number of dead. It was the spectacle of nobility and futility standing side by side so often that neither could be separated cleanly from the other. Achilles blazed, terrible and magnificent, and then was gone. Hector stood for duty, tenderness, and doomed loyalty, and then was gone. City after city of feeling gathered inside Troy's walls. Families, prayers, habits, kitchens, songs, private hopes, and all of it moved slowly toward flame, because beauty, pride, and oath had pulled too hard on a world already inclined toward violence. Zeus could intervene in moments, tilt weather, delay a fate here, grant a passage there. But he could not unweave the whole cloth without unraveling the structure of destiny itself. That helplessness pressed on him. He, who had once imagined kingship as the capacity to establish order, now faced the bitter knowledge that order does not abolish tragedy. When Troy finally burned and night turned red around its towers, the old thunderer did not exult. He watched as one watches a necessary yet terrible surgery performed too late to save all that ought to have been saved. Afterward, ash drifted where music had lived. Survivors moved through smoke, carrying remnants of households larger than anything they could still protect. In that scene, Zeus saw the whole age of heroes beginning to recede. Great names would remain, songs would remain, but a threshold had been crossed. The gods had been too entangled in human conflict, and humans had become too capable of their own scale of ruin. From this point onward, Zeus's story would tilt away from direct shaping and toward something quieter, sadder, and more enduring. The slow transformation of divine presence into memory. After Troy, the sea did not instantly become innocent again. Ships still crossed it. Traders still followed routes once shadowed by war. Yet something in the tone of the age had altered. The old heroic brightness now came veiled in afterthought. Songs about the war carried as much mourning as triumph. Widows, fathers, wandering survivors, and cityless exiles entered memory alongside the famous fighters. Zeus heard those songs. They rose from hearths, camps, and later courts, and they told him what kings often learn too slowly, that no victory belongs only to the victors, because grief circulates more widely than glory. Even when new peoples and futures emerged from Troy's ashes, the smoke of that destruction remained in the long human imagination. For Zeus, this was another lesson in restraint. Fate may require endurance, but it never becomes clean simply because it has been fulfilled. The world after Troy was not finished. It was sobered. Even after the fires died, Troy kept burning in recollection. Children were born who would never see its walls, and yet would inherit its sorrow through song. That, too, affected Zeus. He had always known that divine actions echo, but Troy showed him how long human memory can keep a wound alive. A city can fall once in stone, and many times in story. This is why he grew more reticent after that war. Speech from on high cannot always heal what repeated telling preserves. Better, sometimes, to let dawn come quietly over ruin and allow the living to build whatever tenderness remains possible. Faith does not usually vanish in a single dramatic hour. It thins. It changes posture. It forgets how intensely it once looked upward. Zeus began to feel this before most of the other gods admitted it. Temples still stood. Smoke still rose from altars. Festivals still returned with the calendar. Yet beneath the continuation of ritual, attention had shifted. Mortals were building not only shrines, but schools, assemblies, arguments. They still prayed for rain, victory, fertility, or safe passage. But increasingly, they also asked questions the old forms of reverence could not entirely contain. What causes thunder? What is justice without immediate divine strike? What sustains a city more reliably, sacrifice or law? Human thought, once so dependent on stories descending from Olympus, had grown bold enough to turn inward and outward, at once to examine earth, sky, self, and society, as if meaning might be found, not only by kneeling, but by studying. Zeus watched this with mixed feeling. Pride sometimes stirred in him, because curiosity was part of what made humankind luminous in the first place. Yet loss stirred too. To be remembered symbolically is not the same as being addressed personally. Olympus itself changed under that thinning reverence. The mountain did not collapse. It quieted. Feasts grew less frequent, or perhaps simply less necessary. The old laughter that once moved through bright halls like warm wind now echoed in longer intervals. Athena adapted most gracefully. Wisdom can survive a change in its forms of worship. Hermes found paths through every age. Dionysus reappeared wherever ecstasy still broke ordinary frame. But Zeus, whose identity had long been tied to sky, law, kingship, and direct address, felt the alteration more intimately. One evening, standing where cloud meets the edge of mortal sight, he looked down upon hearth smoke rising from countless homes. The smell of bread and labor traveled upward. Families lived, loved, feared, and endured often without naming him first. He saw philosophers speaking under colonnades, tracing order through reason. He saw rulers invoking justice in civic terms rather than merely sacred one. He saw children learning stories of the gods as inherited wonder rather than immediate truth. None of this erased him, yet it repositioned him. Zeus understood gradually that domination by awe cannot last forever if the beings below are allowed to develop fully. And perhaps, somewhere beneath his grief, he also understood that this development was not betrayal alone. It was the completion of something Prometheus, Pandora. Law, suffering, and all mortal striving had been preparing from the start. Humanity had become capable of carrying parts of the divine within itself. Judgment, imagination, fear, courage, wonder. The gods were not vanishing so much as diffusing. Still, diffusion can feel painfully like loss when one has once sat upon a clear throne above the world. Athena, perhaps more than any other, tried to help Zeus see this thinning faith without mistaking it for simple ingratitude. Mortals, she suggested in many quiet conversations, were not always turning away from the divine. Sometimes they were carrying divine gifts into forms that no longer looked like old worship. Law courts, poems, philosophies, observatories, codes of hospitality, even the disciplined search for truth, all these could be understood as transmuted reverence. Zeus heard her, and some part of him agreed, yet agreement did not dissolve longing. To be transformed into symbol is honorable in one register and lonely in another. The voice that once answered prayer directly must learn to accept echo. So he spent longer hours in contemplation, watching weather move over lands that named him less often, and yet still lived by principles his reign had helped bring into form. The loss was real. So was the continuation. As the centuries stretched, Zeus's image loosened from the immediate present and entered the deeper current of recollection. He was still called upon, still renamed in other tongues, still absorbed into other empires and frameworks, but more and more he existed as pattern rather than person. A ruler in Rome could invoke a sky father in state language, and yet feel far from the hidden cave on Crete. A poet could write thunder into verse, and mean by it power, longing, judgment, or memory, without expecting an actual hand to part the clouds in reply. This transformation might seem like diminishment, yet myth often survives exactly by ceasing to insist on one narrow literal form. Zeus became harder to locate, and therefore harder to exhaust. He lived in legal metaphors, in emblems of authority, in the instinct to look upward when storms gather. He lived in the eagle's arc, in the uneasy pause before lightning, in the idea that justice should be larger than the individual who administers it. He lived in stories told at evening, when the day's labor was done, and the mind was ready to rest inside something older than itself. That is why the ending of Zeus's story cannot be a hard ending. The child hidden from a fearful father did become king. The king did become judge, lover, father, witness, and weary guardian. But he did not remain only any of those. Over time, he entered a final, softer state. He became the felt relation between human smallness and cosmic scale. He became the mood of weather when it reminds us that explanation is not the same as mastery. He became, in a way, the memory inside wonder. Somewhere a storm still gathers over the sea. Somewhere rain taps at stone, the way it once tapped outside the cave where Rhea held him. Somewhere a child wakes in the night at the sound of thunder, and before learning the language of atmosphere and pressure, feels the old trembling that says the world is larger than any room, larger than any plan, alive with forces both frightening and beautiful. In that instant, Zeus is near not as a tyrant demanding fear, not even as a monarch asking praise, but as the ancient echo of a universe that first learned to speak through sky. The world below goes on building, questioning, forgetting, and remembering by turns. Temples may fall silent, names may blur, yet as long as there remains some pause in the heart before rain, some upward glance when light splits cloud, some longing to understand power without surrendering beauty, he is not gone. He has simply become quieter, and quiet, in the end, may be the most enduring form of divinity of all. Memory gave him odd consolations. Somewhere his story was being painted on a vessel, somewhere sung by a wandering poet, somewhere argued over by philosophers who no longer believed in him as their grandparents had, and yet could not stop returning to his image when trying to think about power, justice, sky, and kingship. Somewhere a ruler borrowed the eagle. Somewhere a judge invoked balance under open air. Somewhere a mother told a child that thunder was once imagined as the movement of a god. In all these acts, Zeus persisted indirectly, It is one of mythology's quietest consolations that a god need not remain literal to remain alive. Perhaps, as ages turned, he came to prefer this half-veiled survival. Worship can become rigid, memory is more fluid. It enters wherever the imagination still has room. And perhaps that is the final mercy of the myth. Zeus does not vanish into nothing. He becomes gentler than power usually allows. Once he was the answer to terror, then the manager of order, then the witness to human striving. At the last he becomes atmosphere again, but not the formless atmosphere of the beginning. He becomes weather informed by memory. He becomes the sky after history has passed through it. To feel him then is not to cower. It is to pause, to sense continuity, to understand that what once ruled from above may later endure by surrounding rather than commanding. The old god sleeps lightly in the world, and the world sleeps under him. So the night does not end, it only deepens into rest, and somewhere beyond the cloud line the old sky keeps watch without asking to be seen. Far below, roofs darken after rain, paths glisten, a window stays warm in the night. Someone turns in sleep and hears the fading roll of weather crossing the distance. Someone else, waking for only a moment, feels that old mixture of smallness and comfort that comes when the world reveals its scale without cruelty. Then the feeling eases, breath slows, the mind lets go. This, too, belongs to Zeus now, not command, not judgment, but the spacious calm left behind after the heart remembers how large the sky is. He does not insist, he surrounds, he waits in blue morning after storm, in silver water under cloud, in the low hush that follows lightning, when even the earth seems to rest.